Hello and welcome back to KINE 404, an introduction to epidemiology. My name is Richard Armenta, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about measures of mortality that are commonly used in epidemiology. So the objectives for this lecture are to describe the role that rates play in measuring health and disease, and to calculate various types of mortality rate that are commonly used in epidemiology to describe disease burden in the population. So we previously talked about the different types of rates and ratios and proportions that we use within the field of epidemiology to describe disease. And in this particular lecture, we're going to focus on the mortality rates that are given here on the left-hand side. And we're going to go through several different types of calculations that you'll be required to use throughout the course to describe disease in the population. So just to first remind everybody of what a rate is, because we're going to be calculating a lot of rates throughout this class. A rate is a proportion or a ratio that specifies a time period. Rates contain the following elements: the disease frequency, which is the numerator, so essentially how often is this disease outcome happening, whether that is death, whether that is diabetes, whether that's some cancer, or whatever it is. It also includes the unit size of the population, our denominator, so essentially who is in the population that we're calculating this rate for. And importantly, it includes the time period during which the event occurs. And so time becomes an important part of the rates because it allows us to specify exactly when things are happening and gives us a more complete picture of the disease burden in the population overall. There are multiple different types of rates, which include crude rates, specific rates, and adjusted rates. As I previously mentioned, we're not going to talk much about adjusted rates in this class, but just know that they are available and you may see them out there. And so it's important to just know that they're also an important measure of mortality in our population to describe different disease frequencies through overall. And so let's just start out, and we're going to start first talking about crude rates. So crude rates are based on actual unadjusted numbers of events in a population over a given time period. So this could be something like the birth rate, which would be the number of new births in the population in, say, 2018, how many children were born, or what was the rate of birth. It could be the death rate, which could be in the population, how many people died in 2018. A key feature of these crude rates is that the denominator includes the total population. Typically, that denominator includes everybody in the population, either at the start of the time period that you're doing the calculation for, or more accurately and more preferably, if possible, the average size of the population at midpoint. So essentially, how many people do you have on average in the population? So you would look at the midpoint of the population and say, how many people do we have during that time period? This becomes important especially for dynamic populations where people are constantly moving in and out of the population. And so because of that fluid number, depending on which population size you choose, your calculation can come out slightly different or sometimes drastically different if your population is changing rapidly. So the first crude rate that we'll talk about, and one of the most important measures of disease frequency in the population that we use, is the mortality rate. And mortality rates are the most common measure of disease frequency used in epidemiology. And they are usually calculated from using existing surveillance data, essentially, where all deaths are recorded on death certificates, including the cause of death. So what was it that a person died from? So our crude death rate is just the number of deaths in the time period over the number of people who are at risk of dying, or essentially our total population during that time period. And so obviously nobody is not at risk of dying, and so our crude death rate becomes the number of people who died, say, in 2018 over the total population size in 2018. And that gives us a total number of, or a mortality rate in our population that we can use to compare how death is or how mortality is changing over time. And what we would expect to see typically is that our mortality rate would decrease as we have more advancements in healthcare and in better treatments for different diseases that people are commonly dying from. These types of crude rates can be limited, though, because they don't allow you to do really good comparisons across populations or between populations, because differences in crude rates may be the result of some systematic factor, and we've previously talked about this. So for instance, if we just calculated a mortality rate in California compared to the mortality rate in Florida, we would, if we just did that overall, we might see that they're similar to each other, or that maybe California has a higher crude rate, mortality rate than Florida does. But that would potentially just be a result of the fact that there's different populations, and that we're not taking into account the population distribution within those two locations. So for instance, the age distribution, and this is where those adjusted rates would come into play that we're not really going to calculate in this class, but our adjusted rate would change our calculation based on who the population is. So if we see more elderly people in the population, then we would adjust our numbers for the fact that we see more elderly people in the population, and that we would expect a higher number of people dying as they get older, because as we get older, we have a higher risk of dying. And so these crude rates can't allow for full comparison across populations, especially when there are things like age different distributions, or maybe job differences, where you might have a location where there's jobs that are riskier that people are engaging in. And so because of that, the mortality rates are higher. And so we always want to be a little bit mindful of how we interpret crude rates and what they actually mean, especially when we're comparing different populations to each other. So then the next type of rates that we're going to talk about are specific rates. And so specific rates are rates within a specific subgroup of the population or from a specific cause. So for example, our cause-specific rate is the number of events of a specific type over the total population that's at risk for that particular event happening. So we can look at the heart attack specific rate, where we can look at number of heart attack deaths in the population over the total population, because theoretically speaking, anybody in our population, regardless of age, is at risk of dying from a heart attack. However, when we talk about that from the crude calculation of that crude cause-specific rate of death from heart attack, the interpretation of that becomes limited, because we would expect, again, that a population that has more elderly would have a higher heart attack death rate compared to a population that has more younger people, just because the risk of dying from a heart attack increases as age increases. And so we still have to be careful about how we're interpreting these cost-specific rates. Another type of specific rate is the age-specific rate. And the age-specific rate is just the number of events in a specific age group over the total number of people in that age group. So for example, we can compare the number of deaths among those who are age 5 to 14 years old over the total number of 5 to 14 years old, 5 to 14-year-olds in the population. And what becomes really important, and what I hope you're noticing a little about these specific rates, is that our denominator is extremely important in these calculations, because we have to define who our population at risk is. So if we look at something like heart attack, theoretically our entire population is at risk for a heart attack. But we might want to look at some both age and cause-specific heart attack death rate, where we can say what's the death rate or the mortality rate from heart attacks among those who are over 60 years old. And then we can compare those to those who are between the ages of 45 and 60. And so then that can give us a little bit more granular information about causes of death in the population at different age ranges. And we do these a lot for looking at the leading causes of death in the United States. The other thing that becomes important too is making sure that the people that we're including in our denominator are actually at risk for that cause of death. So we've used this example in the past where, say, we're looking at the ovarian cancer specific mortality rate, where we're looking at the rate of mortality from ovarian cancer. When we're looking at our total population at risk, we would only want to include people who have ovaries, so biological women who have ovaries that can get ovarian cancer. If we include men in our population at risk, then we would highly underestimate the actual mortality rate from ovarian cancer because a large portion of the people in our calculation can't actually get that disease that we are doing the calculation for. So as you're doing problems in the class, be mindful about what your denominator is and who you're going to include in your denominator for your calculations. Another type of mortality rate that we commonly use in epidemiology is called the infant mortality rate. And this is used to assess the risk of dying during the first year of life. Infant mortality rate is used really commonly to look at the overall kind of health of a population and how well our medical systems are doing. Because if we have a higher number of infants under the 1 year of age dying, then that might indicate that there's something going on that's leading to those higher rates of death. And so infant mortality is equal to the number of deaths among children who are under 1 year of age in a certain time period over the number of live births during that same time period. And so to illustrate this, I wanted to show you, and first before I show you, how do you think the United States does in terms of infant mortality when we compare ourselves to other countries that are of similar gross domestic product and similar development level? So mostly European countries and others who have similar access to medical systems and other things that we have in the United States. So think about that for a minute. How do we do in infant mortality in the United States? And so this figure shows the infant mortality in the United States to comparable countries, and that comparable countries means that those are having similar GDP or gross domestic product per capita in at least one of the last 10 years when compared to the United States. And this gives us the infant mortality per 1,000 live births in 2014. And so what we can see here is when we look at the United States, and we can do an interpretation of this, they're at the top, or we're at the top, we see that in 2014, there were 5.8 cases of infant mortality, so children dying under the age of 1, per every 1,000 live births in 2014. When we compare that overall to those other countries, we're doing the worst compared to those similar countries. And when we look at all other countries combined, that comparable average, we're almost double most other countries that have similar development to us in the United States, and almost triple that of Japan and Sweden and some other countries. And so what I want you to think about, and something that we'll talk about in a future lecture, is why are we doing worse with infant mortality in the United States? We have a lot of great medical care that can be provided. We have some of the best training for doctors. We have we spend the most money on medical care compared to all other countries. We also have a lot of medical advancements happening through research. So why is it that we're still doing really poorly on infant mortality? And this is something that we'll talk about in a future lecture on health disparities and social determinants of health. So now let's move on. Another mortality measure that we use in epidemiology and in public health is case fatality, which is the frequency in which cases die of a particular disease. So we can calculate the case fatality rate, which is the proportion of persons who die from a disease. And so this is, while it's called a case fatality rate, it's really a proportion and not a rate, because we're just dividing those who die from a disease over the number of people who have that particular disease. What's really important is that anybody that we're including in this calculation has to meet the case definition for that particular disease. So if you don't remember what goes into a case definition, make sure you go and review what that is. The case fatality rate, or case fatality, is used to represent the severity of a disease. So what that means is if the case fatality rate is high, say we calculate it and we come up with 90%, so it's usually expressed as a percent, then that would mean that 90% of people with that particular disease die from it. Whereas if we do that same calculation and we come up with 1%, or 0.5%, then that would mean a very small proportion of the people who get diagnosed with that disease, who meet that case definition, will actually die from it. And so these become an important way to describe the severity of disease, not just to individual patients, but also in the population overall. And then the last measure that we'll talk about for mortality in this lecture is the proportionate mortality ratio. And so this is a ratio that we use to describe the number of cases of mortality or death from a specific cause in relation to the total number of deaths in the population in that same time period. So our calculation for proportionate mortality ratio is the number of deaths due to a specific cause in some specific time period over the total number of deaths in that same time period. And so what this tells us is a quick look at the major causes of death in a population. It's a proportion, not a rate, but we do typically like to do it in a specific time period because it allows us to do comparisons to see how the main causes of death are shifting throughout time. So for example, if we look back into the early 1900s, some of the main causes of death in the United States and globally were infectious diseases. But now today, the majority of the leading causes of death in the United States, the majority of them are chronic diseases. And so we've seen what we call this shift or this epidemiologic transition where we've moved mostly from seeing a lot of people dying from infectious diseases to a lot more people dying from chronic diseases. And that often has to do with how development happens in different countries where we've gone through this really big economic and development and industrial boom that's changed the types of jobs that people in and things that people are doing. But also we've had greater healthcare that has been able to treat infectious diseases better. And we've had the development of things like vaccinations that have led to much lower risk of dying because we have much less people getting those particular diseases. So our proportionate mortality ratio, and one thing that's important is that it does not tell us about the risk of dying. It just tells us overall in our population how many people die from different types of diseases. And typically we'll see the largest proportion of deaths in developed countries being those from chronic diseases, whereas we typically see a lower proportion of deaths from infectious diseases. And so rates and these proportions that we've talked about are the basic tool in epidemiology that we just use to describe frequency of disease in the population over a specified time period. These rates, especially the mortality rates, the cause-specific mortality rates, and infant mortality rates, they put disease frequency within the perspective of the size of the population. So they adjust the number of deaths by the number of people who are in that population and allows for better comparison across populations. However, we do want to be careful in interpreting differences between populations with using these crude rates because they don't take into account those systematic differences that we might see between populations, including things like age differences or occupation differences or whatever that might be. So rates are useful for comparing disease frequency in different locations at different times or among different groups of people with potentially different sized populations. And many of the rates that we talk about are a measure of risk, and they can convey how quickly disease is occurring in a population. So the higher the rate, the more quickly we're seeing that disease happening in a population. And so they become important for us for examining health. Rates, as I've already mentioned, provide more complete information than other calculations do, and we should be using them to interpret things about the health of the population overall. So if you have any additional questions about rates or you're not sure how some of these calculations work, make sure you reach out for help. Otherwise, make sure you watch the next lecture on measures of morbidity, which will focus on incidence and prevalence in the population. Thank you.